So, welcome. Lesson 13 now of Restorationist Apologetics. We're on a part 3 of Jehovah's Witnesses Apologetics specifically. Previous lessons we've obviously covered different topics revolving around more auxiliary topics, 144,000, things like this. In the previous lesson, which was part 2, so lesson 12, we looked at theology proper, so Trinitarian doctrines, and pneumatology, so the doctrine of the Holy Spirit. Today, for lesson 13, as well as in the next lesson, lesson 14, which will be finishing off this JW section, we're looking at Christology. Okay, so in other words, the doctrine of Christ, as that's known. Right? Doing it over 2 parts. There's 6 major points. I'll explain that as we get into it in just a moment. But 3 of them today, 3 of them in the next lesson. Those are the basic core fundamental points that you have on your notes. So again, it would be helpful. Maybe even if you can remember next time to bring the notes. It won't be necessary, but it would just be helpful for lesson 14 to bring today's notes. But the Christology subject we're doing today and in the next lesson, okay, and covering basically what the format is to keep it streamlined, otherwise we'd be spending a bunch of lessons on it, is focusing and honing in on the kind of primary text or key text that the JWs will often reference. It's usually not the only one, but it's definitely the central one, right? The logic behind that being that if we address the more notable or central texts that they will point to justify their heretical views, then the rest will kind of like dominoes fall in suit, if that makes sense, right? So that's the kind of method we'll be going through. And you can kind of see that if you glance through your notes, each 3 of the points we'll be looking at here today, points 1, 2, and 3, have a specific Bible reference, okay? So reminding you, kind of as we've done each lessons, the notion of doctrinal development is foundational to JW theology. Of course, they point to places like Proverbs chapter 4, verse 18, quote, "But the path of the righteous is like the bright morning light that grows brighter and brighter until full daylight." That's the New World Translation version. Things, when discussing things with JWs, you need to keep in the back of the mind that they have a doctrine called doctrinal development. Okay, so things of ongoing revelation. We don't have ongoing revelation. Right? The canon of Scripture is closed, it's set. Ongoing interpretation and revelation occurs in the JW religion, so it's important to keep that in mind. But nevertheless, as I pointed out, Christology. So what is the fundamental premise, like we've done in this format in previous lessons? JWs deny and reject what I'm referring to as the complete eternal deity of Jesus Christ. Okay, what do we mean by this phrase, complete eternal deity? Of course, deity meaning divinity. Those terms are being used synonymously here, right? So his godhood, in other words, the fact that he is a god. They believe that he is a god. We're going to see that in just a minute. But that's why we have these 2 adjectives that we're using here: complete eternal deity. Okay, so complete, in other words, the fullness of deity. The full essence of what that means to be God, more on that as we go through, as well as the nature of it being eternal, so having always existed, past, present, and future, even beyond the word past, okay, eternal, before the very creation of time or anything else itself. Keeping in mind that, as we've already seen, as we're going to continue to see, the Jehovah's Witnesses are very prototypical, straight down the line Arians. Okay, they believe fundamentally, as we'll see, that Jehovah, God, who they call the Father, creates Jesus Christ, and then Jesus Christ creates everything else. Okay? That's the fundamental belief, and that's what we're going to be working with here, but that's their basic fundamental Christological premise, right? The denial and rejection of the complete eternal deity of Jesus Christ. So how and in what way do they do this? There's a variety of arguments, 6 that we're going to be covering particularly. This is on page 1 of your notes, and I'll read them all here in succession. 1, that Jesus is a created being, the first and greatest creature. 2, Jesus is not Almighty God, right? He's not Jehovah, but a lesser subordinate divine being. Okay? So they believe he's divine. That's why we use the words complete eternal deity. Okay? They believe he is divine. However, they believe that he is subordinate, and therefore lesser, that's what the word subordinate means, lesser and subordinate in his divinity than the one true God, Jehovah, or the Almighty. Okay? Point 3, Jesus is the same person, the same figure as the Archangel Michael, right, who existed in heaven before his incarnation, okay? So when they read Scripture and they read the handful of times that the Archangel Michael appears in, well, most specifically the books of Daniel and Revelation, which is where he features, at least in reference, that is Jesus Christ as far as they're concerned. Okay, so the figure of Michael, St. Michael the Archangel, and Jesus Christ, they are the same being. Okay, obviously, again, non-Christian belief, heretical belief, but we'll get onto that later on. So what that effectively means, and we'll touch on that a bit, is that Michael is his pre-incarnate state. When he comes into the world, he is then Jesus Christ. He then ascends back into heaven, spiritually, not bodily, that's another belief, and returns to being Michael the Archangel. Okay? So Michael the Archangel, that is to say, from the JW perspective, Jesus and Michael the Archangel are the same person, same figure. Okay? That's point 3. Point 4, Jesus became a perfect man during his earthly ministry. Okay, so they do not believe that he was, that's why we say the word complete eternal deity in the premise. They do not believe that he was eternally and completely perfect in his divinity and therefore his sinlessness, these kinds of things, right? He becomes a perfect man actually during his lifetime, okay? Hence why we say earthly ministry. Point 5, after his resurrection, Jesus returned to heaven as a glorified spirit being or spirit creature, not in a body, okay? So in other words, not in bodily form or as a bodily human, okay? So they deny the physical bodily ascension of the Lord, right? They believe it's they believe it's spiritual. So that's actually a very Gnostic position. So that point 5 there really is a combination of Arian positions from earlier points with now a Gnostic position, okay, which denied the bodily resurrection and ascension of Jesus, right, in favour of a spiritual resurrection and ascension. They believe a very old Gnostic position, which is the spiritual resurrection and ascension. And then point 6, Jesus is not to be worshipped, only Jehovah is to receive worship. Jesus being a lesser subordinate divinity is not the, definite article, the one true God, okay? Those are the basic Christological points. We could technically expand that list beyond that, but this is the fundamental tenets that encapsulate their basic Christology, right? What they believe about Christ, okay? So for us, let's start on point 1 there. Jesus is a created being, the first and greatest creature. So next slide. As you see in your notes, John chapter 1 verse 1 is definitely the go-to, and really the words that are beyond that flowing forward, but particularly that beginning of John's Gospel. En arche en hologos, kai hologos, prostotheon, kai theos en hologos. And the word was, as they translate it, a God. Okay, it's a very infamous portion of the New World Translation. For us in English, in our accurate translations, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Okay? Their translation adds the indefinite article a in English, so the word was a God. Okay, this is this point we're seeing about the lesser divinity, right? Not the one true God. The Greek phrase I have listed for you there, and I've put a transliteration into English as well for you in parentheses, kai theos en hologos, which if we were to say it in English would be so kai and theos, God, ein was hologos, the word, and God was the word. In English we need to fix the syntax, so we say and the word was God, right? But their fundamental claim is that since the word theos, okay, which is in the Greek there, it's the second word that begins with an oval with a line through it. That's the Greek letter theta, th. Theos, T-H-E-O-S in English, right, which is the generic word for God, used all the time in the Bible. Since theos, God, lacks the definite article, it's called anarthros, in other words, without the definite article. Just to explain this point, we have this, other languages have it, right? In English, we have what's called the definite article, the, right, and indefinite, a. So the difference between the dog and a dog, okay? Greek, as we're about to see, in this case, Koine Greek, ancient common Greek, the kind of Greek that the New Testament and the Bible at large is written in, including the Old Testament as well for the Septuagint, does not have what's called the indefinite article. So there's no ancient Greek word there's only the, right? So plenty of times you'll see the word the. In fact, it actually features there. The ending of that sentence, as you can look at your transliterated version, ho logos, H-O, new word, logos, L-O-G-O-S, right? Ho is the definite article for, in this case, logos, the logos, okay? So the word. But if you notice the word theos, which is the second word in this little phrase, it doesn't have ho theos, right? There's no definite article the. Their argument, right, it's very, very important, right? And again, I know we're getting deep, but this is the point of these lessons, is to try and examine and learn some of these more complex things that we don't often get to talk about in sermons and other such things. They argue that because that it is indefinite, meaning the word God. So let me explain to you what this is meaning. In Greek, ancient biblical Greek, because that language does not have an indefinite article, so when it wants to put it in there, it'll just simply say the noun. So in this case, theos, right? Now in certain contexts, in fact most contexts, you would then translate that by inserting the English word because basically the rule in Greek is that if it has the definite article, it puts it in, ho, logos. If it doesn't, so in other words, if it's logos or dog, whatever, it'll just simply drop the definite article. Does that make sense? Yeah. That's a normal standard rule in Greek, which applies, it happens all the time in the Bible, right? They then take that principle, which is true, and then apply it to the word theos, because in that phrase, they're correct. The word theos, God, does not have a definite article. It's a noun, so again, prima facie arguments, we talked about this before in previous lessons, seemingly plausible arguments that on the surface kind of make sense. Their argument is that, well, because it doesn't have the definite article, we should be inserting the indefinite article in English, so God. They claim that John, as in the Apostle John, the author, is distinguishing the word, so hologos, the word, from the God earlier referenced in the verse, implying two separate beings, that there's two different beings in view here, Jehovah God, and then this additional divine subordinate being, the Word, right, Jesus, okay? They believe that Jesus is the Word. That's not what they agree with us on that, but they're arguing that this verse, John 1, verse 1, is distinguishing between the two beings, the Logos and God, who's been referenced earlier in that verse, right? In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God. Okay? Because hotheos is actually the reference in the previous phrase. Right? So when we see in English, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, that reference to God has a definite article. Okay? We don't say it in English because it wouldn't make sense. We would have to then try and say it in English, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with the God. It wouldn't really make sense in English, right? Because we don't put the definite article the before God, because God is a proper noun. It's his name, right? So you don't say, and then I went and spoke to the Daniel, right? So in English, we have to make it make sense for us in our language, right? But in Greek, it has the definite article because that's normal in ancient Greek. The last clause, and the Word was with God, the theos, God, no longer has the definite article. So their plausible prima facie argument is, well, clearly it's changing. Clearly now it's dropped the definite article, which means we should say our God. Again, seemingly plausible. And so they appeal to Greek grammar all the time here. Let me be more specific. They're older and far more experienced apologists and evangelists for the JWs appeal to the Greek all the time. Vast majority of JWs are not learned in Greek, obviously, as are most Christians, and that's fine. I've only ever encountered one JW evangelist who's actually properly learned in Greek. I've never, beyond that point, encountered anyone who is, right? But they will often try to cite the Greek because that's what they get told is the case. They get told through the literature that this is actually what the real Greek's saying, and the Christians with their false Bibles have changed it and blah, blah. They misquote and quote out of context Greek scholars all the time, right? But that's their fundamental argument, okay? So what's the counter-argument to this? Now, next slide. I'm going to make this as simple as I possibly can, okay? You don't need to remember all the specifics here, but I'm going to do my very best to make the point clear, because the point is very much understandable, right? But this is how, when you're dealing with ancient languages, you are, and the more specifics, these are the more interesting and complex parts, okay? So, here's the counter-argument, and it is fortunately true for us, which is good, right? This last phrase, kai theos en hologos, right? And the word was with God, or as they say, the word was God. It's a qualitative reference, so qualitative meaning quality, okay? So what is the thing, okay? Is a qualitative phrase, not an indefinite, right? It means that the word, the hologos that's in reference, the word, has the same nature as theos, God. Okay, hence the term quality, right? It's not that it's a separate or lesser being. Now, the reason why I point this out is because there's actually a Greek linguistic rule. It's called Colwell's rule, okay? And you see some words which, if you're not familiar with linguistics, you may not recognise. I'll read it and then I'll explain what that functionally means, okay? Colwell's rule is a rule that we've understood in regards to ancient Greek for about 100 years now. I think about 1933 Colwell's rule was formulated, right? But Colwell's rule, which is like you have different rules or laws in physics, for example. You have things like, or different things like Occam's razor or Schrodinger's cat. You have various different kind of concepts and rules that are things that people have identified as this is how this works. And if you don't understand it or you deviate from it, you're going to find yourself not understanding the point, right? In terms of ancient Greek, Colwell's rule states this, that when a predicate nominative, right, you won't know what that means and that's fine, but a subjective noun, in other words, a noun that's the subject of the sentence, okay, basic primary school, high school grammar, right, sentences have objects and subjects, right, and they're joined by a preposition or they're joined by a verb, right, the boy threw the ball, right, the boy is the subject, the ball is the object, and you have a verb that joins them, through. The boy, subject, threw, verb, the ball, object. In this case, both definite articles. Or it might be in English, indefinite. The boy threw a ball, whatever, right? Different forms, subject, joining, verb, in this case it's a verb, object, right? So, the predicate nominative, which in other words means the noun that's the subject of the sentence, which in my little example of the boy threw the ball, the subjective noun, so the subject that is the noun is the boy. Okay, so that's the predicate nominative, right? The boy threw the ball. When the subjective noun precedes the verb, like threw, and lacks an article, so in other words, it doesn't have that definite article ho, like ho logos, right? Or in the case of our actual sentence, there's no ho theos, it's just theos. It is describing its quality. Now, look back up in... We don't need to go back there on the screen, but on your notes, look back up on that first bullet point beneath John 1:1, okay, where it has the Greek there and the transliteration, okay? Kai, which is just the Greek word for and, so and, theos ein hologos. Theos, subject, ein, en, that's the verb, it's the verb meaning to be, right? So I am, right? To be something, it's a being verb. Hologos, object. And theos was hologos, or you could conversely say hologos was theos, right? This is a direct example of Colwell's rule, right? Notice the basic things. So the subjective noun, theos, precedes, in other words, comes before the verb, ein, cool, that's true, so point 1 tick, point 2 tick, and lacks an article. Theos has no article, so we're 3 for 3 at the moment. What that means in basic ancient Greek linguistics is that it's not actually a, so you can't insert the word a It's actually describing something different. Namely, what it's saying is that it's describing its nature. That's why I said qualitative, right? It's a qualitative phrase, not an indefinite one. Okay. Other examples include, even in that chapter of Colwell's Rule, I've cross-referenced one there, but a couple of verses later in John chapter 1, verse 14. And the Word became flesh, right, and dwelt among us. And the Word became flesh. In that case, kaiologos sarx acheneto. Exact same feature. The Word, so hologos, just like we have here, became acheneto, so the exact same root word en, acheneto, you can hopefully see the connection there. Something else, sarx, but it has no definite article. It has all three features. The noun, the subjective noun coming before the verb without the definite article. Guess how the JWs translate that phrase. Do they say A, and the Word became a flesh, or do they say, and the Word became flesh? If you answered B, you'd be correct. So, they apply Colwell's Rule in verse 14, but then choose to ignore it in verse 1. See the point? It's the very same author, John, in the very same language, Greek, in the very same book, the Gospel, in the very same chapter. It could not possibly be a more obvious distinction. All but like a paragraph later, effectively, right? A couple of sentences later, they choose to uphold Colwell's Rule in verse 14 because it doesn't change their doctrine. But because verse 1 of the prologue, in other words, John chapter 1, would clearly contradict their belief, their Arian belief that Jesus is a lesser subordinate divinity, they choose to ignore it. They can get away with it among their own people because it's a plausible argument. Because normally in Greek, ancient Greek, because it doesn't have an indefinite article, it only has the definite, the, and the rule normally is, which is true, like I said earlier, when Greek wants to show that it's indefinite, so it's a dog, or the boy threw a ball, it'll just simply drop the definite article, which is what happens in the end of verse 1. The problem is, Colwell's Rule very clearly explains when you have these three basic elements, subjective noun, so the noun is the subject of the sentence, it comes before the verb, not after, but before the verb, and that subjective noun lacks the definite article, then it's not describing indefinacy, it's actually describing its nature. It's a different concept. It's describing what it is, not how many there are. So quality, not quantity, right? Because there's a difference between the ball and a ball, right? The ball means it's the only one generally. A ball means he's got a soccer ball, a basketball, a football, and he picks up a ball. So that's quantity. Colwell's Rule is what Greek does when it wants to describe not quantity, so how many, hence why you have indefinite articles or definite articles, but rather the nature, i.e. the quality, not quantity. And they choose to uphold Colwell's Rule a couple of sentences later while purposely choosing to ignore it back in verse 1. This is why these kinds of classes are good, because we can get into the nitty-gritty and the weeds of ancient Greek linguistic features, but helping us to understand that even though, again, if you're not terribly well read in linguistics, which is fine, the vast majority of people are not, these basic elements actually prove the veracity and the truthfulness of Scripture, right? So remember, that's what Colwell's Rule is, right? The noun is the subject of the sentence, hence the term subjective noun, right? What's formally called a predicate and nominative, right? But the subjective noun comes before the verb, and the subjective noun does not have a definite article. When those three factors are combined, it inherently means that it's describing quality, not quantity. And that's why this translation must be, and the Word was God. Because if it was the Word was a God, it's now really the focus is about how many gods there are. That would be quantity. The Word was God. Now was is about quality, not quantity. And that's the accurate translation. Right? Cool. Understanding that basic element helps you to understand why it should be our God, because that's the problem, is that they can come with really plausible arguments, and in the first little interim they can go, well, don't you know that the Greek only has a definite article and doesn't have an indefinite article? Well, look here, and they might even try and show you the Greek, because they can rote memorize things without having actually learnt the Greek. If they've been taught the little kind of play card formula of here's what you show them, right? I've had people try to do that before, where they don't actually know the Greek, but they've practiced the routine. Does that make sense? Like they've practiced the evangelistic routine, so they'll open the Greek and they've learnt a little bit, so they know they know that phrase, and they know they've got the little play card of say this, and then step 2 say that, and step 3 say that, right? That usually falls apart when I ask them to start reading the rest of the chapter, which they can't do, and I can. But nevertheless, understanding this helps you to combat that, because they may well try that if you're having a discussion. They go, well, but in Greek it doesn't have the definite article, so when it doesn't have the definite article, it means it's the word are. And if you know zero about Greek or zero about this passage, you'll go, okay, you won't know what to do, because it's sophistry. It's a plausible argument on the surface, but once you actually get beneath the surface and learn the truth, you then come to realise that they're actually wrong, like dead wrong, and intentionally and knowingly wrong, because they translate it correctly in verse 14, but they choose not to in verse 1. Cool. Let's go to the next section, right? We can learn more about this, but the second section, right? So back for me. Yep, backwards, I think. So point 2, right? Which is going to be that Jesus is not Almighty God, right, but a lesser subordinate divine being, right? So one of their primary texts is Colossians chapter 1. This is now on page 3 of your notes, sorry, pardon me. Colossians chapter 1, verse 15, where Christ is referred to as, quote, the firstborn of all creation, okay? What is their basic argument around this very important verse? I've seen this referenced many, many times by them, right? So Jesus is called the firstborn of all creation. That's true. And so therefore, he is the first being created by God, because after all, it says firstborn, right? This term firstborn, prototokos, I'll explain that in just a second, is interpreted by the JWs in a literal and chronological sense, right? So literal, fairly self-evident, right? And chronological. So he is the firstborn, like I, for example, am the firstborn, right? I'm the eldest son, eldest child of my parents, right? So I am the prototokos of my family, okay? They interpret that in a literal, chronological sense, right? Just like you would for a child that's born first, okay? So what does that phrase mean? It's helpful for us to understand this Greek phrase, okay? This Greek word, prototokos, right? It's 2 words, a prefix, proto, P-R-O-T-O, and the root word tokos, which means to bear, okay? Tokos means to bear or to give birth to, okay? So like we've covered in our church history course through the early church, right? One of the rightful titles of the Blessed Virgin Mary is Theotokos. For those if you remember the councils of Ephesus and Chalcedon in the 5th century, right? The God-bearer, the one who bore God in her womb, because if she was only Christotokos in the context of the Nestorian controversy, it would mean that she only bore the human nature and that Jesus then became God later on, right? Tokos, from that Greek word to bear or to give birth, right? Proto, meaning first. So actually an English word that uses this you'd be familiar with is something like prototype. Okay, so proto, first, type, form or type, literally. The first type, right? When someone's inventing something, it's a prototype. It's the first version of it, right? It's the first type of it, okay? This is what that Greek prefix proto means, right? The first in order, okay? Prototokos, therefore, is the standard word for firstborn, right? I am the prototokos of my family, for example, right? The firstborn son. They then couple that with verses 16 and 17, so in other words, following on from verse 15 where it says that he is the firstborn of all creation. The next two verses then continue to say all things were created through him. Okay. However, the JWs in the New World Translation render that phrase as by means of him all other things were created. Okay. So if we said in English, all things were created through Jesus Christ, it clearly demonstrates, even just in basic English, that everything in existence came about as a result of him, which means what necessarily? It means that he is not part of that creation, because after all things were created through Christ, right? He is clearly being separated from the definition of the word all, right? But because they render it as by means of him all other things were created, it opens the door to Jesus also being defined as created, right? Because their basic belief is Jehovah, God, creates Jesus, then Jesus creates all other things, right? Hence why, as I say, it's an attempt to imply that Jesus was created first, then all other things were created. Now, what are the counter-arguments to this? Right? There's 2 points there we'll come back that are referenced to both verse 15 and then verses 16 and 17. Right? First of all, pardon the pun, is that word firstborn. Okay? Prototokos, firstborn, which is again a very standard word. Right? In biblical usage, however, and the scriptures often do this, right? This is not the only place. There's actually a variety of different times where the scriptures do this. God will take in his word a word that is common parlance and understood very normally in common vernacular Greek, right, in the ancient world, and not eliminate the usage, the common usage at least, but either highlight a less common usage of that word, because that's how words often used. We have that all the time in English, where we have the common way a word is generally understood, and then more special cases of different types of words that we can utilize in that particular sense, right? He will often at times highlight a lesser usage of the word, or he will actually expand the definition or the understanding of the word. And you can see this contextually, right? This is one of those cases where he's using the secondary or tertiary usage of the word. There's the common way, which the majority of the time, prototokos means like the firstborn son, for example. Ishmael, was technically the prototokos of Abraham, right? The firstborn son. So then when you get into the New Testament and you have, like in Galatians chapter 4, I believe it is, references back and forth, the ending of Galatians 4, where you have the apostate Jews and Judaism, the religion of the Pharisees, compared to the prototokos, the firstborn son, Ishmael, and the faithful church, both Old and New Testament, the church, referred to as the true Israel, and as the church, and as referenced to Sarah. This is this kind of usage of firstborn, right? The literal term firstborn. In this case, however, we see plenty of examples where the secondary or lesser utilized, less common usage of the word prototokos, firstborn, is used. The most obvious example I've given you there are other examples, but this is just one of the most obvious, is in Psalm 89, verse 27. Okay? Back in verse 10, I believe it is. Yes, it would be verse 10, I think. Earlier on in that Psalm 89, David is literally named, right? So this psalm is very clearly talking about David. Okay? By the time you get to verse 27, the term firstborn, prototokos, exact same word, is then applied to David. Now, for anyone who's familiar with the book of 1 Samuel, you'll know that David's not the firstborn son. Okay? David was actually the youngest, right? He had older brothers. That's part of the whole the kind of origin story of King David, right? He is a he's a young man in what would be his teenage years. He's a young man. He's a shepherd boy. His older brothers are, a number of them are actually in the army, the Israelite army. He has older brothers, and of course, he goes to Jesse, that is the prophet Samuel, goes to Jesse, and he's looking for the one that God has directed him toward. And I'm paraphrasing the story here, but what does Jesse do? He shows him all his older, big, fit, strong warrior sons, right? And then said, no, that's none of them. It's not him. And then he says, well, there's young David, right? So we know David's not the firstborn son. In fact, he's the opposite. He's actually the youngest. But David is explicitly referred to in verse 27 of Psalm 89 as the prototokos. What does that tell us? Well, it tells us that the word firstborn there is clearly not a literal chronological reference. Does that make sense? It can't be. We know David's not the firstborn son. So the question is then, why is the psalmist in Psalm 89 referring to David as prototokos, firstborn? Well, it's because that word in Greek, apart from its common usage of a firstborn son, is also at other times used to describe kind of the first in rank or in significance or order, right? The importance, basically. First in rank, right? The highest of something, right? That's a common way as a secondary form, that is, or a secondary usage, that the word firstborn in Greek, prototokos, is used, right? The first in rank, the first in significance, the first in importance or status, right? So that's why David is referred to as prototokos, because of course, after all, he is what? King of Israel, right? He's the king. There's no one higher than him, right? So he is the prototokos in this reference, okay? That is the exact same way in which it's being described to as with Jesus. And half the reason why we know that is because what is the relationship between David and Jesus? Well, he's his ancestor. David is a direct ancestor of Jesus Christ. So Jesus is being referred to by the same title, which is what this prototokos is functioning as. It's functioning as a title, firstborn. The exact same title of what we call an honor, right? It's a title of honor, right? That his ancestor from 1,000 years ago, King David, was also referred to as in Psalm 89, verse 27. Does that make sense? It's not describing a literal firstborn child, because neither is this exact same phrase, exact same word being applied to a direct ancestor of his. It's not even just some random person in the Bible. It's a direct ancestor of his, right? That's why the Apostle Paul in Colossians 1, verse 15, refers to Jesus as prototokos, firstborn of all creation. What does that mean? He is the highest rank over all that exists. He is, like David was the prototokos of Israel, the king of Israel. What does that mean Christ is? King of all creation. You see what I mean? It's a title. It's a titular reference, in other words, a title, right? So that's how we understand the word firstborn. And that's an ironclad argument. Right? There's no way around that. It's very intentional why the Apostle Paul is utilizing that word prototokos, firstborn, in Colossians 1, verse 15. The second part of that, which is that whole thing in verses 16 and 17, right? Through him or by him, all other things were made. That's actually a very obvious thing, which is actually really doesn't require you to know much Greek at all. It just requires you to know basic logic. The word other, Allah, A-L-L-A in Greek, is nowhere to be found in that verse. So this is actually one of the more obvious cases where they just straight up add a word that's not there at all. At least this is why I want to show you these kinds of arguments, because at least with John chapter 1, verse 1, right, katheos and hologos, that whole issue of Colwell's rule, you at least have to get down into the more the weeds, as it were. There's complexities of ancient Greek linguistics that you kind of need to know to understand why. So they have a plausible argument. Plausible being the operative word. It falls apart upon examination in light of Colwell's rule, right? But at least they have a seemingly plausible argument on the surface level. Here, they don't even bother with any of that. They just straight up add a word that's not there. Right? They just straight up add the word other. It's not there at all. And what they do, again, this is why, in many respects, again, the eternal wisdom of the Word of God, my people perish for a lack of knowledge. Knowledge and wisdom are two sides of the same coin as far as the Bible is concerned. They're not exactly the same thing, but they are two sides of the same coin that are deeply related and inherently connected to each other. My people perish for a lack of knowledge / wisdom. Because without knowing that, that's how every lie that the JWs tell about this verse is propagated. It's just basically chugging along the railway track on the inertia of their own people not knowing the Greek of verses 16 and 17. It's just pure ignorance. They just literally don't know, right? Again, this is one of those other passages that in the times when I'd be able to open up a Greek New Testament and say, "Can you start reading this for me?" And they can't, and say, "Can I explain it to you?" And say, "Do you know the Greek word for other?" "No." "Okay, what's the word other?" "And here's what it looks like. Here's what the A looks like. Here's what the L looks like. And here's what the other L and the other A looks like." Cool. Now just read it again. I want you to see if you can find that word. And no, you can't find it there because it's not there. It's just straight up not there, right? The way we bring it into English, right? All things were created through him is a very, very literal translation, right? It's what we call formal equivalence, right? It's a direct, almost word-for-word translation, right? And so it's really obvious. When you add in another word, it's so obvious because you can't, it's just not there at all, right? So that's super important for you to know because this is such an obvious Arian passage, right? You can clearly see what they're doing, right? By throwing in the word other, and all other things were created through him, well, that means that they've opened the door for something else that's not in that other to have been created. All things were created through Jesus. That means that anything, all that was created came by him, which means by definition he's not part of the all. It means he's not created, but they want people to believe that he is created. So then they say all other things were created, which still hypothetically leaves room for something else, Jesus, to have been created, and then all other things apart from his creation were created. And the only way they can do that, because it's not even remotely what the Bible says, is by completely just adding a word in that's not there at all. Simple. You don't really need to know the specifics of the Greek. You just need to ask them, say, where's the Greek word? Where's the word other in that Greek sentence? It's not there. Right? It's not there at all. So that's the issue with point number 2. Point number 3, which again is on our original list there. Jesus is the same person as Michael the Archangel who existed in heaven before his incarnation, right? Now, the way that they go about this, is they use, well, at least in my experience, they commonly use this verse, although it's not specifically talking about the issue of Michael the Archangel. It's more specifically talking about his created pre-existence, so to speak. And we'll get onto the whole Michael the Archangel issue in just a second. But what do they look at? Well, they look at, primarily in my experience, Proverbs chapter 8, verse 22, where it says the words, "Jehovah created me at the beginning." Now, what's going on here? If you're unfamiliar with the book of Proverbs, the first 10 chapters of the book of Proverbs is a long and lengthy piece of discourse and literature on wisdom, specifically. Obviously, the whole book of Proverbs is part of the wisdom literature, the section or the subsection that is called the wisdom literature, right? The Psalms, the Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Songs, etc. But the first 10 chapters of the book of Proverbs is specifically about kind of capital W wisdom, right? And what Solomon, who's writing this section, does is he personifies wisdom, okay, as a woman, right? Quite a common thing, actually, in the ancient world, of course. There's nothing inherently wrong with that. It's speaking anthropomorphically or in a personified fashion, that is to say. Of course, even abstract ideals in Greek and Roman culture, of course, had personifications. Libertas was the Roman personification of liberty. Okay, hence the term libertas, right? all the various different elements. Again, nemesis, the Greek personification of divine justice and vengeance, right, where we get the English word nemesis from, right, an enemy, etc., etc. All these various different concepts have personified deities in the ancient world. This is picking up on that common custom. In this case, it's not deifying wisdom necessarily, although it kind of does, but only in application to Christ. But it personifies wisdom as a woman. Okay, and that's a common way of thinking about these things, right? There's nothing wrong with that, because it's poetic in nature. It's not to be taken literally, right? So what do? Well, they come to this, right? So again, this whole portion here through Proverbs is talking about wisdom, right? So Jehovah, right, God created me at the beginning. Okay. They take this passage where wisdom is speaking, right? Because you can see, obviously, this is in the first person here. This is wisdom speaking. Jehovah created me at the beginning, right? And they apply it directly to Christ, thereby interpreting it to mean the following. A, Jesus, as wisdom, was the first creation of Jehovah, because after all, they believe this is Jesus speaking as wisdom, and wisdom has just said Jehovah created me at the beginning. Point B, created me, therefore necessarily means that Jesus had a beginning, because of course he was created. Right, so this is one of those passages that they use, kind of like what we just saw with Colossians, to justify Jesus being created. Okay? Now, counter-argument to this, which is the next point here, right, is a couple of things. And this is the hypocrisy element. It's much like with Colwell's rule, right? In point 1, ignoring Colwell's rule in verse 1 of John 1 and then applying it accurately in verse 14, right? It's hypocrisy. Okay, it's a double standard. Proverbs chapter 8, as I mentioned, is poetic in nature in terms of the genre of the proverb, book of Proverbs, whereby it personifies wisdom. Applying it directly to Christ is at best hermeneutically questionable and at worst outright wrong. Okay? The reason why is this. They will take this as a literal, and interpret it literally in reference to Christ. But what they won't do is take, say, for example, the pronouns. Because, as I said to you, wisdom is being personified as a woman. And so wisdom is consistently, in the first 10 chapters of Proverbs, being referenced as she. So they will take a literal interpretation that wisdom is literally Christ, but then they won't take the pronouns and therefore say that, well, therefore Jesus is a woman. Because after all, it's a she that's being referenced. They won't do that. Do you see what I'm saying to you? Right? And that's correct, right? Because Jesus is a man, right? Cool. But my point is, it's hypocrisy. They're selectively choosing to be literal here, but then ignoring the literal she here. Do you see the problem with that? Right? If they were being consistent, they should refer to Jesus as she, right? Because after all, the entire the JW religion, as far as they're concerned, is built on taking the Bible literally. That's their whole shtick. It's a big thing for them, right? We take the Bible literally. But they don't take the Bible literally when it comes to she. Do you see what I'm saying too? In the same passage, same exact chapter, right? This is what I meant by hypocrisy, right? It's completely hypocritical, right? So that's the fundamental issue, is that they use a literal hermeneutic, so hermeneutic interpretive methodology, right? We've talked about that before. They'll use a literal hermeneutic of taking wisdom to literally be Jesus, but then won't take the pronouns about wisdom, she, literally, even though it's about the same figure, wisdom, right? It's not even disconnected, it's the same figure. That's point 1. So you should call them out in that hypocrisy if this ever comes up. But point 2 is that even if we apply wisdom to Christ typologically, because it is and is not, it's a complex subject, right? There is definitely, it's kind of like with King David in the Psalms, okay? When it's talking about David, it actually is talking about David, but typologically it's also, as a secondary, kind of more prophetic layer, talking about his descendant, Christ. But it's not either or necessarily. You can't say, oh, it's not talking about David at all. No, it is talking about David. And in fact, primarily contextually, it's talking about David, right? You can't then, so for example, when it comes to Psalms where David is penitent, like the penitent Psalms from David, that cannot and should not be interpreted as Jesus repenting of something, right? Obviously, right? But other psalms, which are messianic psalms specifically, there is the layer that prophetically foreshadows Christ. Okay, this is the case with wisdom, right? There are things in regards to wisdom in the literature, in the wisdom literature, like Proverbs, that are actually just specifically about wisdom, like the Lord created me at the beginning, right? There are also other parts where it is also typologically referencing or foreshadowing Christ, who of course is the true essence of wisdom, for sure, right? We get this in a very specific sense as well. And again, a bit of linguistics here just to dive into that help us understand how this works, right? In this particular phrase, again, the Lord, or as they would translate it, Jehovah created me at the beginning, or in the beginning, same thing. Jehovah created me at the beginning. That word created there is the Hebrew word kana. Okay, you can think of it as like Q-A-N-A-H with a soft H at the end, right? Kana. Very specific word. Has a fairly wide semantic range. So semantic range, it means what are the different kinds of meanings that are categorized in this word. What kind of different English words can we use here? Some words have very strict, narrow semantic ranges. Others have quite wide. Some have a bit in the middle, right? This says one of the words goes more middle. There's a couple of different ways we can understand this word in English, right? But it means effectively to acquire, to receive. We even see it being applied to purchasing actually quite often. In fact, this word kana is used often actually in the Old Testament to describe someone purchasing land, right? So purchase, acquire, you can see that kind of meaning, right? The reason why I'm pointing this out is because it is a distinctly different word than the normal Hebrew word, and the same thing would apply for Greek, I'm just choosing the Hebrew, right? For create, right, to create something. And that is, there's a couple of different words we use for create / made / formed. Those are technically different things, and I'm not going to get into the nuance of that because it's not really our focus here. But the basic word for create is bara, B-A-R-A. Okay? So, for example, Bereshit bara Elohim. In the beginning, God created. Okay? Namely, what? The heavens and the earth. So Genesis 1:1. Okay? Doesn't say kana, right? Acquire or receive. No, God created. There is a very normal, standard, direct word for create something in Hebrew, and that is bara. Other variants, atzar, yatzar, we don't need to get into the distinction of what those mean, but they're different shades and variants of create, made, formed. So there's a slight difference between God creating the world and then forming Adam, right? Because he creates the world as a generative process and then forms Adam from the ground, from the dust, from the ground, right, from the earth. There's a pre-existing material, right? Very interesting subject to teach about, right? But not what we're focusing on here. He doesn't use the word bara or atzar or yatzar, various different words. He uses a different word, the author here, kana, meaning to acquire or to receive, okay? To purchase, to possess, right? And so it's why the vast majority of English translations use the word possessed, right? The Lord possessed me in the beginning. In other words, the Lord had me, right? Notice how that creates a different slant in English, very different slant, in fact, right? The Lord created me at the beginning, very clearly like a generative, creative process. It didn't exist and now it did. Versus the Lord possessed me, the Lord had me, the Lord had me at the beginning, right? The Lord acquired me. Whatever you want to, again, possessed is contextually the right word here because we have other contexts where this exact same feature comes up and we translate it possessed rightly. They also translate it possessed rightly as well, by the way. In other sections, they intentionally choose to translate it created here. The word kana just really does not, it can theoretically mean create, but that's not really what it means, right? And so all throughout the scriptures, in their New World Translation, they'll be rightly using possessed, to purchase, to acquire, whatever, to have in that more generic sense. But then here they'll choose very obscure translation of created because it fits their ideology, right? Not what it means, okay? Especially because of the hypocrisy element. I'm saying about the hypocrisy of the whole, well, wisdom is literally Jesus, except all throughout this very same chapter, including the rest of the other chapters from chapters 1 to 10, that same wisdom, which you literally believe is Jesus, like direct one-to-one, literally Jesus, is being referred to as she. So you won't interpret that literally, but you will interpret this literally. Hypocrisy, okay? It's the chopping and choosing. Actually, ironically, just to finish off this point here, because we are effectively, this is the third and final point which we're going to cover today. Next slide for me, thank you. Paul? Next slide for me, thanks. This being the end of the lesson here, is that it's actually much like what we spoke about, ironically, in today's sermon, fascinating enough. The whole adding to or taking away from God's word. It's taking a pair of scissors to the Bible. In this case, this is that literal form where they do that, right? So they will literally add words that are not there, like other in Colossians 1:16, right? All other things were created through him, right? Which is not there. So they're adding to the word of God. And then other parts they will take away. They'll take away theoretically, for example. So this is one of those theoretical taking away, right? They will take wisdom to literally mean Jesus, but then ignore the fact that that same wisdom is referred to as she. So they're taking away that part. Do you see what I'm saying to you? It cuts both ways. They're both adding to and taking away from the word of God, functionally, theoretically, or otherwise, right? Because that's all you're left with, right? The reality is that you either take the word of God as it is, in fact, right? And that requires interpretation. And there are parts of Scripture that are just extremely straightforward, very, very clear. We know exactly what they mean. And then there are multiple layers on a spectrum where there are actually some really complex parts of the Bible, to be totally honest with you. Very, very complex, that are surrounded by very serious, rigorous discussion, including especially at the academic level, which is more of my background. And that's all totally fine. In fact, we should expect that, because after all, we're dealing with a completely unique piece of literature, unlike anything else in existence, that comes directly from God via human agents, right? We should expect it to be complex. It's dealing with the very nature of God and reality and history and salvation. Of course it should be complex, right? However, it's able to make wise the simple, as the Psalm says, right? Simple meaning the not so intelligent or not so bright, right? And that's okay, we're all different, right? But it's able to make wise the simple, right? It also has what we call perspicuity, right? It's a doctrine called the perspicuity of Scripture, the clearness, right? And so we use the clear parts to interpret and understand the more less clear parts, right? But this is hiding facts, it's adding in words, it's relying on the ignorance of their own people, not knowing Greek, which is, again, that's what's a bit more pernicious, just to finish on this point, is that you're not expected to know Greek or Hebrew, right? You don't necessarily need the Hebrew because we have the whole Bible in Greek, Old and New Testament, right? But you're not expected to know classical languages from thousands of years ago. You don't need to learn it. It's not like you're missing out something in the Christian religion if you don't know it. That's why God appoints ministers, and that's why God has guys who he teaches these things, who can then try and articulate it as best as they possibly can, right? And that's cool. However, what the Watchtower does, what the JWs do, is they then pray. They prey upon a totally normal ignorance, right? Just like you had at various different times on all kinds of things. I know it ends up. I know almost every conversation somehow ends up coming back to things these days, but to this subject. But it just is what it is because it's so recent. It was so massive. That was the primary issue during COVID. Right? Is the total and utter dependence of everyday normal Aussies on what the experts are trying to tell them about how things are working. The problem is, as it then turns out years after the fact, they were lying. They're lying through their teeth, right? People with, and anyone, and parts of those experts, academics, other such people, even just people who are generally learned in certain subjects, at least to a non-academic degree, who were saying, well, actually, that's not right. They were silenced, shut down, cancelled, whatever, right? So that works until they lie to you, right? This is what happens. This is the entire Watchtower's existence, right? They're so looked up to, so venerated as the sole infallible authority for how any of this is meant to work. And they, prey upon the ignorance, rightful, normal ignorance. It's not like they're stupid because, you're a JW and you don't know a language from 2,000 years ago. No, of course you're not stupid. It's got nothing to do with that, right? Vast majority of Christians don't know Greek, and you don't need to know Greek. It's helpful. It's really, really useful. It's helpful and useful if you're in my position. In fact, many of my positions should be encouraged to do it. But for the other 99%, there's no need to. And so if I were to then come along and do the same thing, which I have access to every single Sunday, I can just get up here and waffle and make up whatever I want effectively, and if it seems plausible, it's going to go right over everyone's heads, right? That's why the Apostle James says that, and others say that, make sure that few of you become teachers, because you'll face twice the judgment on the great day of judgment, right? Because there is a power that the clergy have, right? Through no fault, no one's fault, not God's fault, not our fault, not your fault, right? And that is the proverbial conduits, theoretically speaking, of knowledge, right? So we have to be responsible with it, right? And so that's why you've always heard me say, don't just take my word for it, or I'll meticulously go through and I'll show you. Like, that's why this course is a perfect example of this, right? Especially in this regard to these kinds of subjects. I'm not just saying, and here's what the JWs believe, and then just kind of moving on to the next subject. No, I'm showing you what their arguments are, how they make that argument, I'm then also showing you why it's wrong, what the counter-argument is, and why the counter-argument that we're making is actually correct. I'm not just saying, and here's the counter-argument. No, I'm saying here's the counter-argument, and here's why, right? Because I could get up here and twist facts and lie to you just like they lie to their own people, but I don't want to do that. I want to actually show you the raw facts and the information so that you can know that I'm actually giving you accurate information and telling you the truth, right? Even in this more simplified form, because this is not a super duper complex course. It's designed to be simplified so that we can be workable with it, right? That's that. So that's Christology. Obviously here, lesson 13, part 3 of our JW Apologetics. We're going to continue Christology on those remaining 3 points that you have on that primary list in the next lesson, all right? Cool. Very good. Any questions? Go ahead.
So my question to you is, have you challenged a Jehovah's Witness person on where that word other is
Yes.
missing in the Greek, and also with the wisdom literature that it refers to wisdom as she, and if you have, what is their response to that?
Yeah, it's a good question. So have I ever had a conversation and challenged the JW on both the absence of the Greek word Allah, meaning other, and the reference to wisdom in the personified feminine, rather feminine personified as she? Unfortunately, no to the latter, because that's such an obvious stark contrast. No, I haven't had occasion for that. But absolutely actually both of the first 2 points from the day. So John 1:1, I've had extensive conversations multiple times on John 1. And as well as then also Colossians 1, basically verses 15 to 17, effectively. Both those times, yes. In fact, actually, that's the most recent one that occurred when the JWs from up here stopped coming around to our house. Was the penultimate time was... I had plenty of other encounters before that. I've had other encounters elsewhere, in Sydney and other places around, just not here, along these lines as well. But the penultimate time was actually in reference to John 1, when very lovely single mother with her 3 kids, JW out wandering, God bless her heart, evangelizing for her religion as she sees it, and came up and we started chatting, blah, blah, in our driveway. And I said, cool, hold on a sec, I just want to go grab my Bible. Went in and grabbed my Greek Bible, and asked her to read John chapter 1 for me in the Greek, which she couldn't. And again, so I'm saying to you, that's totally normal, but that's what they do. They push people out there who have no meaningful knowledge, and then when they come into contact with someone, not just me, but anyone else who knows what they're talking about, it's a disaster. The next time, and so that whole discussion crumbled inside of about 5 minutes, because you had someone who's is fluent in Koine Greek, and someone who's not. Didn't know any of it at all. The next time was when they sent around two of their elders, an older couple. Sorry, one would have been an older, but an older couple. The gentleman was one of the elders at this local Kingdom Hall, and he knew his Greek wasn't bad. Actually, probably almost in the same level as mine. Both John 1, we talked about John 1 for a while actually, and then I went to then I went to Colossians 1:15, and we talked exactly about that subject. And I asked him point blank, where is the Greek word for other there? And it's just, there's no answer. There is no answer. And the way that JWs work is, because a lot of these conversations are like chess. You're playing kind of verbal chess, like you've got moves and you're thinking a couple of steps ahead about where you want to go and what moves you want to make after that move. And so the JWs have a playbook, and that's literally, like, they actually straight up have a full-blown written guide from the Watchtower as to what to do. Like if talk about this subject, get to this subject. If person A says this, then say that. If they say that, then say this. Right? They have that. I've read that manual before. So I already know what arguments are going to try and fall back to. But in that case, he tried to fall back to one of those arguments that they try to fall back to, which is a woefully bad argument. At least the one that he offered was basically trying to explain that that the actual case of the preceding noun inherently includes the concept of the negative. It's a negating, what would be called a negating predicative, which just makes no sense when you actually know the Greek. But anyway, it seems plausible to throw it out there if they said it to any one of you who don't know Greek, and you go, "Oh, this guy has an answer." No, that's nothing. They're making stuff up. And so as soon as I then challenge on that, the conversation just immediately tries to shift to another topic. Do you know what I mean? So they just change the subject because there's no real answer. It's a very blindingly obvious thing. They just straight up add the word other in English, and it's not there at all in the Greek. The excuse that they have for it is basically what would you say? Well, it's a gap stop. It's basically a kind of, you point out there's no Greek word for other there. They come back and give you a technical sounding answer, hoping that you actually don't know Greek, and that can kind of just fly under the radar. Does that make sense? Right? Which is also a very pernicious thing. It's kind of like what I was talking about earlier, right? You throw out a bunch of technical terminology to sound like you know what you're talking about, but in reality you don't know what you're talking about. And the problem is that works when the person you're talking to, in the case of the JWs, also does not know Greek. Right until you get someone who does know Greek and who can go, what you just said is literal nonsense. That's nothing. you literally just made that up off the top of your head, right? So that's what they do, effectively. No, I have not had an encounter yet, unfortunately, maybe one day, about the wisdom literature part and the reference to she, the complete hypocrisy of you take it literally here, but you don't call Jesus a woman or she. I'd like to. That'd be a fascinating one to. I'd love to see how that unfolds in real time. But yes, no. When it comes to, they usually just have no answer, and they try to change the subject. That's the thing. That's why you've got to try and stay on track when you're talking with these people. God bless them, because as they're immediately defensive, and rightly so from their perspective, because they're wrong. That's the unfortunate part. But what they will attempt to do is, again, they already have a playbook in the back of their head. You've got to understand that they have a flow chart going on mentally where they want that conversation to get to. So whenever I'm talking to JWs, I have my own flow chart. I know exactly how I want to start the conversation. I want them to say out loud this, this, and this, so that by the time we get half an hour later down to here, I can remind them of exactly what they said half an hour ago. Do you know what I mean? Now that's sophisticated, I get that. But in basic terms, you're trying to guide and direct the conversation, right? Thing is, they are too. So it's a bit of a mental game that's going on, but that's just the nature of how these things work, unfortunately. You know. No real answer they have, because it's just such an obvious thing. The Greek word for other, not there at all. And they just straight up add it in English. Yeah.
If you can show them that word is not there,
Yep.
then they deny that.
They can't. That's the thing. That's what I meant earlier about.
Then don't they wonderful
Hopefully they do privately, because keeping in mind as well, hopefully you want them to, because a lot of the conversation with JWs, to be totally honest with you, is just about planting the seeds of doubt in their mind as to their own religion. Do you know what I mean? With the truth. So truth is shining a light on all the cracks in everything that they believe, and it's that's the space in which the Holy Spirit works, right? Because He can then start to convict them of and the conscience and everything else. And so for them, if they start to realise, because with the single mother I was referencing at that penultimate time that they came by our house, I almost felt bad afterwards. Not actually, because it's just truth and error at the end of the day. So I didn't literally, but I almost was tempted to feel bad, because it was an existential crisis. Like, her entire countenance changed. It was like it's like she had just stepped into the. I'm not trying to talk about myself. This would go for other people too, who were in my position. But it was like she just stepped in the ring with Mike Tyson and got punched for the first time in the face and realised, oh boy, because as soon as you pull out Greek, it's such a sink or swim. And so her entire demeanour changed, her countenance changed. She looked like she was afraid of me. That's how bad it was, this conversation. I was like, oh, so bad. But because it's like, she was so out of her depth. They never should have done that to her. They should never have sent that woman out into the world where they might encounter a Christian who says these things to them. To be honest, I'm not saying that tongue in cheek, but who knows? That woman, her faith in the JWs might break down as a result of that conversation. 10, 20 years later, I got no idea. I have no idea. Nothing may come about. I don't know. That's God's work. But you want to catch them in that scenario, not because it's a gotcha thing, but you're shining light on darkness. You're shining truth onto lies, abject lies. And you're right, because I know what you mean. Like, why don't they have an answer? Because the watchtower and the authority of the JWs is preying upon the ignorance of its own people. They're just purely hoping that none of their people ever actually study this stuff. That's why they're encouraged, like we saw about in early lessons, even questioning anything is sinful. So they're definitely not going to tell their family or their friends about that encounter. They're just not going to talk about it. Do you know what I mean? It's completely cultic.
And sometimes there's 2 or 3 of them up on the main street, so when you try and they might obviously see they're there and
Yep.
later, but there and then.
That's a great point, 100%. And that's why you will always find them in groups, okay? No, true. Dad said, at the moment, these days, they're set up there across from Station Bar at the top. Good real estate, because they're catching people coming up from the station. But that's why they're always in groups. This was a very unique thing. Again, it's just a single mother out with their kids. That almost never happens. That's why I was really, really wanting to talk. Because part of the reason why they operate in groups, apart from just generic safety, which is fine, right, is group influence. So when I'm having a conversation with, and this is touching to your point, Bridget, when I'm having a conversation with JWs, one of the first questions I always ask them is, how long have you been a JW? Like, how long have you been a witness for? Right? I don't call them JWs. I say, how long have you been a witness for? Right? Because I always want to find out who's been a witness for a short amount of time. Because I want to talk to them primarily. Or sometimes, actually, often what I want to do is actually talk to the main person first. Because what I want to do is I want the young person who's been, let's just say one of them was born into it, or someone had only converted like a couple of years ago, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, something, I don't know, whatever. Naturally, the person born and raised in this is so much more inculcated in the JW religion, right? They're definitely the veteran here, right? Depending on what subjects we're going to talk about, I might want to talk to the weaker person to expose some of their issues. It's not going to last that way, because eventually the veteran will take over, right? That's fine. Sometimes I actually just want to talk to the veteran, because I want the younger JW to, when I say younger, maybe not in age, but younger in how long they've been in it, I want them to watch. And I want them to see that this person, who they already look up to anyway, because this is the older, wiser, more experienced witness, their arguments aren't working, and they're faltering in this discussion. And they are witnessing it, pardon the pun, they're watching it without having to actually be the subject. Do you know what I mean? It's like a lieutenant in the military scolding his troops, right? A bunch of the troops may have actually stepped up in that platoon, right? But if he starts yelling at one single private, right? The other privates are probably equally as well. It's like, and the individual private's going, why are you picking on me? He wants the other privates to see what's going on, or especially if he starts going hard at the section commander, right? Like a corporal, for example. Well, the privates were like, oh boy, he's going hard after the corporal who's higher ranked than me. Hopefully he doesn't go after me that way, and they snap in line, because they don't have to take the brunt of it, but they see it, right? And this is why they do that stuff in groups, because for them, it protects them individually from getting exposed, right? More importantly, it gives them a control, namely that, let's just say one of the younger in the JW, like younger JWs, starts listening to that and going, oh, that's a good point. You think he's going to say out loud, that's a good point? Of course he's not because he's got two other witnesses right next to him who are then going to go back and tell the elders of the church that, hey, we think that Timothy has a problem. We saw him agreeing with that Christian. Do you know what I'm saying to you? So they control each other basically through groupthink, like socially. It's very, very pernicious, very, very cultic tactics, straight down the line cultic tactics, peer pressure. That's why they do it.
Obviously they've got it wrong, which says Jesus is not Almighty God.
Mm-hmm.
But then, it says, Jesus, I am the way, truth, life. No one comes to the Father but through me.
Mm-hmm.
And there is no other name unto salvation
Mm-hmm.
but Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
Where do they stand on the cross, salvation, and getting saved?
Great question. I'll answer it in part because we're going to partly discuss it in the next lesson as well. But at least in the basic essences, yes, they believe that Jesus was crucified. They believe in the bodily crucifixion. So they're not like Muslims, for example, who believe that Jesus was secretly not crucified and that God actually made Judas to appear as Jesus. That's another ancient Gnostic heresy. They actually adopt a different Gnostic heresy, which is they as we mentioned earlier, in passing, we'll talk about that in the next lessons, they deny the bodily resurrection and therefore ascension of Christ. They believe that he only rose spiritually and therefore ascended spiritually, right? That's how they tied into that whole Michael the Archangel thing. Because obviously Michael the Archangel is just that, an angel, ergo he's a spiritual being, right? The angels, whilst the angels can appear in human form, they do not actually have a material, corporeal, as in physical form, okay? They clearly have the power to appear that way, but they don't actually have that like we have that, right? That's how they then justify the whole Jesus is Michael the Archangel thing, right? Because if he rose from the dead physically and ascended physically, well, that means he has a body. He can't be Michael the Archangel, right? The method and the means of salvation, again, is adding on, sure, the essence of the grace of God, plus ongoing sanctification through works of righteousness, participation in communion, although that's ironic because none of them take communion. We've talked about that before, right? Blah, 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 right? So definitely heavily works-based justification for sure, yeah. Like I said, part of that we're going to cover in some of those, like point 5, if you look there on page 2 of your notes, right, part 5, like argument 5, I should say, point 5, after his resurrection, Jesus returned to heaven as a glorified spirit creature, not bodily. So that ties into that whole crucifixion, resurrection stuff. We'll cover that in the next lesson, yeah. So, all right, all good?